to our speaker today for the session. And at the end, before we take any questions, I would like to quickly cover a few more slides, and then we can have Matt answer the questions, which you can post in the Q&A panel. So a quick walkthrough. Data Platform Geeks is formerly SQL Server Geeks, which is a subsidiary of community initiative of eDominer Systems, which has companies like SQLMaestros, Peopleware India, and Expand SRM ERP. So please do explore their sites because there's a lot of information that will be helpful for you. I would like to quickly point you to the Data Platform Summit 2018, which we ended 2 months back, which was very successful with 3 days conference and 2 pre-conference days, which was held in Bangalore with more than 1,000 attendees. As the saying goes, a picture is worth more than 1,000 words. So there are literally 1,000 people in this room, and there are few links with this group photo that we had at the conference. Please do go ahead and explore more about this conference that happens every year. And this is one of the largest data platform conferences that happens around the world, and this is the largest one in the Asia Pacific region. So please do explore. We had a keynote by Rohan Kumar and many other speakers, MCMs, MVPs, and industry experts, and also product team members from Microsoft were at this conference and delivered very interesting and technical sessions. We have already announced 2019 Data Platform Summit. This is again a 3-day event, but we also extended the pre-conference training from 2 days to 3 days. So it's actually a 6-day event in total. We have 7 tracks, more than 100 sessions, more than 50 speakers. Again, product team members from Microsoft Redmond are joining us, as well as the MVPs, MCMs, and the industry experts. This is a 100% learning event. If you have attended Data Platform Summit this year, you would have realized that there was zero marketing. So please do make sure that you register early and get the early bird pricing benefits with Data Platform Summit 2019. You can explore more at dps10.com. This is the core team behind the Data Platform Geeks. Amit Bansal, who is the founder and president. I am Manohar Puna, I'm the vice president. We have Avanish Panchal, who is a regional mentor and also our technical editor. We have Sandeep Pani, Prince Rastogi, and Surbhi Agarwal, who manage and lead the groups that help us lead the user groups that help us spread this word and organize this event across India as well as online. We have the eDominer teams who help us in organizing these events. These are the people, these are the backbone who run these events and help us in growing this community. You can see a pic of all the team members on the stage, and Amit appreciating all the team members. This is one of the iconic pic at the Data Platform Summit. A special thanks to Microsoft, who has been a great support in helping us build this community. If you are attending this webinar today, you would have already registered at dataplatformgeeks.com. We have a lot of free content. If you have not explored, please do explore, because we have free videos, labs, magazines. You can try hands-on labs, which will help you learn. There's a lot of information in terms of videos, as well as the regular events that we do, in-person events and the webinars are all, the conference material is available, as well as the events material is available, and you can view the webinars which are recorded. Join our Facebook group, which is the largest SQL group on Facebook, as well as the LinkedIn group. You can post your questions, or if you think you can answer some questions, that will be really helpful to the community. So this will be a good place to start and get involved with the community. As I've said, we record the webinars, and also some tips, all small technical videos that we record are all uploaded to our SQL Server Geeks channel on YouTube. Please do register. As I speak, we are posting those links on the chat window, so you can explore and join or subscribe to our SQL Server Geeks YouTube channel, as well as join our mobile app, Telegram app, where we regularly post updates about our events, as well as if you have any technical questions also, you can use our mobile channel to ask and get help. And I would quickly like to hand over to our speaker today, Matt Gordon. Matt, up to you.
Thank you. I think you'll need to hand the screen sharing over to me as well.
Yep. So you can click on Start Sharing, and then
yeah, with you sharing, I don't have access to that.
can you see it now?
Ah, here we go. Yep. Okay. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yep, we can see it now.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
No worries.
And we'll go ahead and get this started. Okay. Thank you very much for having me. As he said, my name is Matt Gordon. This talk is about new features and new speed in always-on availability groups from SQL Server 2016 forward. So that now includes 2016, 2017, and 2019 as well. There's a little bit of 2019 information in this talk. I intend to build that out as things become more official on that front, but there are a couple things that I can share with you. Here's a little bit about me. I'm a data platform solution architect for DMI. We're actually worldwide, so I am from the USA, but we have 3 offices in India. We do mobile dev, app dev. I'm part of our data platform and analytics team. It's a really, really good team. And this is in no way a sales pitch at all, but if you're interested in that type of consulting, there's my email address. Personal contacts are at SQL at Speed on Twitter, and my blog is SQLatspeed.com. Here's a little bit about me. So apologies if my voice is a little scratchy. It's about 5:40 a.m. my time, so I'm from the middle of the U.S., the state highlighted in red there. Kentucky, we're known for a couple of things worldwide. It seems like it, as I go around and talk, the 2 things people know about is the Kentucky Derby, the horse race, and more people know about Kentucky Fried Chicken, which is just about everywhere. So if you've heard of where I'm from, it's likely one of those 2 things. And now me. So here's a little bit more about me. I have 15 plus years of experience with SQL Server from kind of every different facet. I've worked on dev teams. I've been a lead DBA. I've been a lone DBA. I've managed data centers, designed them, all that stuff. So I've come at a lot of these issues from multiple angles. I was fortunate enough to get picked to speak at Past Summit last year, and I'll be there again this year. So if you intend to come to Past Summit, feel free to look me up and say hi. I was also awarded my MVP about a month and a half ago now. So very excited about that and excited to be here with you folks virtually this morning. So you may have wondered how I picked my Twitter handle and blog address. And even if you didn't, I'm going to tell you. So this is what I like to do for fun. Occasionally I get to drive race cars. I was actually doing that this past weekend. And as much as I love to talk about data stuff and all that, I enjoy talking about this even more. So if you want to reach out to me and ask me more about this, that's okay too. All right, so now that you've heard a little bit about me, let's hear a little bit about the room. And I think the way we've got this set up here, if folks could type in the chat, obviously raising hands is not going to work. So I'm curious, for those that are able to answer, who's implemented really anything from SQL Server 2016 forward. And I'll give you just a few seconds to check out chat. Okay. Who thinks that you'll likely be asked, and I guess I'll ask this question a little bit different than it's on the slide. Who thinks they'll be asked to implement SQL Server 2016 or later in the rest of this calendar year, say the first half of next year? And again, you can go ahead and respond in the chat. Okay, a few of you. Okay, very cool. Okay, so expanding kind of to every version from 2012 forward, who in the chat, and you can just answer yes, has ever implemented an always-on AG in any version for any reason? Okay, all right. Well, it looks like we have a good mix, so hopefully some of these tips help you, and hopefully there's some stuff in here that you did not know. So let's go ahead and advance the slide. Okay, so we're going to dive right in to the features, and this is just a handful of features. It does not encompass every new feature that's been added from 2016 forward. What it does do is kind of handle what I think are the most critical ones, or the ones that make our lives as DBAs easier. So, round robin load balancing. For me, I feel like Microsoft kind of undersold this. So when they released in 2012 and 2014, there was a concept known as read-only routing. And for folks who may not know what that is, I'll kind of briefly explain what that is. If you set up a listener, you could set up a read-only routing list. And if a connection identified itself with the application intent of read-only, the listener would receive that, see that, and say, you don't want to write anything. I'm going to send you to the first replica in this list that talks back. And later in the presentation, I'll actually show you the script that kind of builds that. So that's the way it worked in 2012 and 2014. I know just going out as a consultant and talking to managers and CTOs and things like that, what they continually asked for was some way to load balance that, because normally you would have had a 3, 4, 5, 6 node AG, and obviously they've paid for all those servers. In many cases, they were paying for SQL Server licenses for all of them in the event that there were failovers or people were connecting to replicas for reporting and things like that. But there was no optimal way to balance that load throughout the AG. There was no native way. So you could buy products from F5 and ScaleArc and things like that, but obviously that's an additional cost beyond an already expensive set of Windows Server licenses, hardware, SQL Server Enterprise Edition licenses, all that. So that was not a very popular answer when I would tell management type people, hey, you're going to have to buy more stuff to actually do what you're asking me about. So when we got to SQL Server 2016, Microsoft gave us round robin load balancing. So it's important to understand what that is and what it isn't. So it doesn't depend on the workload at all. It is very simple, and you'll see I have a short demo later with an AG that's running on some VMs locally here. It has no idea what resources are available on each replica that it picks. So in some cases, if you say somebody's written an extremely poor query that's running against a replica, in some cases, if that's 95% CPU and it's taking all the memory and all that, if that replica is next in the round robin, it's going to receive more work, even though it really doesn't need to. The good things are you don't have to buy anything to make this. It's out of the box. It's a very simple change to setting up read-only routing. You're utilizing all the hardware and licenses you're hopefully paying for. So that's all good stuff. The slight caveat here is if resource dependent load balancing in an AG is still something you need. Again, there are products from ScaleArc and F5 that can handle that. There is an additional cost, of course, but this is a nice solution if you don't want to buy anything, and in most cases it works fine. Actually, in all cases it works fine for most users. Generally, the replicas are not under extremely heavy load, so this is a good solution for most. So here's a syntax example that's fairly simplified about how this works. And hopefully you can see my mouse arrow move, because if I wave my finger at the screen, obviously nobody can see that. So what we're doing here is we're altering a made-up availability group that I've set up and setting up the read-only routing list. So the traditional syntax, more or less kind of started here. You've got parentheses, and then you would end here. So for SQL Server 2012 and 2014, what this would have said is the read-only routing list is SQL 02, SQL 03, and SQL 04. For 2016 and up, there's a second set of parentheses added to the list here. And like I said, hopefully you can see my mouse arrow. If not, it's around SQL 02 and SQL 03. And that's the only change to the syntax. And what this tells it is, please round robin load balance these two. And obviously you could have more than two in there. But it's a very simple change. It's easy to set up. There's no additional network configuration and all that. So if you haven't already established AG, this is a great, easy thing to do to kind of balance the load between all those things. And I will say, even though we're going to hold questions to the end, feel free to ask them as we go along. So we'll kind of have a nice list built up. So on to the next thing. It was really hard to avoid the marketing message from Microsoft for SQL Server 2016. Everywhere you look, they had the tagline, "It just runs faster." And of course, that may or may not be the case, depending on what feature you're talking about and what marketing thing you read and all of those sorts of things. But one thing that does run faster, a good bit faster, are components of the way availability groups communicate, the way the log blocks get moved around and supplied to the different replicas. Specifically, log replication throughput and redo speed genuinely got a lot faster. And we'll talk about on the next slide how much faster it was. But a little setup for this before we talk about what got better. So obviously, when they introduced availability groups in 2012, there was great interest in the feature. A lot of people adopted it pretty early. I can say the company that I was with at the time, we were very early on that as well. As the story's been relayed to me through the years, another one of the early adopters was a large online gaming company based out of Europe. So there were very particular rules depending on the nature of the game and all that. Apparently what country could host the data and all those sorts of things. So they had a very complicated AG topology throughout their organization. Tons of AGs. They had some machines that were primaries for one AG and a replica for maybe one or more others. So they heavily exercised kind of all that availability groups had to offer. And what they started to run into, because they were online gaming, obviously people are looking for instantaneous feedback. There's money involved. If they're winning money, sending money, whatever, that all needs to happen very, very quickly. And the performance simply was not up to what that company needed. And they were not the only one, but it's the story that's been relayed to me from product group folks. They were the most vocal. And so they basically went to Microsoft and said, hey, we really love this feature. It allows us to do a lot of great stuff, but it's not fast enough, and we're going to have to do away with it and figure out some other way to solve the issues that we thought it would solve for us. So obviously that motivated Microsoft to improve the performance of this quite a bit. And so we have them and others to thank for how much better this runs. So before SQL Server 2016, pretty much all of what Always On did internally was single-threaded. So the log capture, the encryption, the compression, largely single-threaded. From 2016 forward, it's largely parallelized. So you get parallel compression of log block data, you get parallel redo threads, and the compression algorithm has improved overall. So not only is it compressing it better, it's doing that more quickly for us, which is very, very cool. And I know even some of my consulting customers here, just upgrading from 2014 to 2016, realized significant performance improvements just from that. They didn't have to optimize code or improve network or anything else. So the big question is, how much faster does it run? And this is where we've got to cut through some of the marketing stuff a bit. So the technical term for how much faster it runs is much more faster. But what it really is Microsoft was stating 20 to 30 times faster for performance of this within an AG. I have only seen that when you kind of set up like what I have on my VMs, a very simple AG doing very simple things. You throw a stressful workload at it for a brief period of time, and you can see that 20 to 30 time performance improvement. But that's in a fairly controlled environment. So in my experience, specifically with customers where maybe all they did was go from SQL Server 2012 or 2014 to 2016 or later, I've seen about 7 to 8 times faster. So that's significant. That's still a very big deal. Not quite as big as the sales folks would have you think, but still very, very good. Another caveat here, and I don't have it on the slide for a reason, because it's a bit of a sliding number to some extent. So we've just talked about how great it is when all this runs in parallel. If you are managing an availability group with a lot of databases, and I've heard conflicting reports as to what this number is, so it's a reason that's not on the slide as kind of official knowledge. If you're running an AG, let's say with more than maybe 8 to 10 databases, some of this gets a little less parallel than I've just explained. So we can talk later. I'm happy to entertain questions about what I think the optimal size of an availability group is and how many databases you should have in there versus how many you can. But the more you put in there, the more you still get improved performance in 2016, but you're not getting things done fully parallel across, say, 50 databases all at the same time. So like I said, that's probably a good topic for the Q&A, but something to keep in mind. I tend to prefer to keep fewer databases in an AG versus more, but there are arguments both ways there. So managing security. So this, I think, is really, really cool. So hopefully you're using managed service accounts. If you are, it's a pretty easy transition here. If not, this will be a bit of a bigger leap for you. So group managed service accounts were released in Windows Server 2012. It wasn't until SQL Server 2016 and later where we could really fully leverage them. And they are very useful in Always On AG. So let's talk more about what these are. They're really, really cool. So as I mentioned, if you're using a local managed service account already, this is going to be very similar, except these have the scope of the domain. One thing I found interesting is depending on what industry you're in, for instance, here in the US and probably around the world, if you're in the healthcare industry or the finance industry, you're under a lot of regulatory pressure. There are a lot of audits mandated by law and by certifications that your data center carries and all that. Those auditors are starting to flag regular domain service accounts, at least in my experience, not as a full security hazard, but as something they don't like. So following that logic forward, it probably won't be too long before it goes from marked in the auditor report as this is a thing we'd like to see changed, and turns into, this is a security flaw that must be fixed before we certify you. So those regular domain service accounts, while certainly a security step up from just, say, a personal account, probably are not going to be satisfactory for a lot longer going forward, especially if you're involved in industries like that, where security is paramount. Group managed service accounts are not likely to be flagged in those audits. Now, it's not something you see a lot of. I know when I give this talk in person, usually I'll ask for a show of hands about who's using these, and I would say it's 10 to 20%. So I'm glad it's in this talk, because a lot of times when I start explaining this, I see a lot of nodding heads and things like that where people didn't know you could use this. So what's really great about it is the password synchronization is maintained across every single node of the AG, and Windows is handling that automatically, basically. Now, this is something, I don't go into heavy detail here about how you set this up, because most organizations that I go to, most people that I speak to, this would be handled by your Windows or your operations team. Most places that I go, the DBAs don't have control of this sort of thing. If you're somewhere where you have, as a DBA, you have control of a lot of the Windows resources as well, please reach out to me and I can send you some good how-tos about how to set these up. It's usually beyond the scope of the talk, because that's getting pretty heavily into the Windows side of things. But it syncs passwords across all nodes. And another key thing is we don't have to restart the service after the password changes. Windows is handling all that for us, which is really, really nice. So not only has your security stepped up, but maintenance-wise, you actually have less to do. You don't have to, you don't have to do that 90-day countdown or whatever until passwords change, and and then you've got to do all the stuff where you change passwords on every node and restart them in a certain order and make sure they all come back up. Windows is handling all that for us, so very, very nice and pretty cool to play with. Okay, so like I said, the tagline for 2016, they kind of walked away from it for 2017 and 2019, but it's still true, is it just runs faster. So what else just runs faster? So actually setting up an availability group itself, specifically replicas, does run faster. So the replica setup, as the slide notes, pre-SQL Server 2016, which is still available to you now, but that hasn't changed. You can still do things the way you've always done it, but it required a full backup applied to the replica, generally a series of log backups depending on how active the primary was. What I know I've experienced, and I'm guessing some of you have experienced as well, is when the databases would get large, up around a terabyte or more, that process could be quite unwieldy. Generally, though, there was no magic threshold, somewhere around there, you would not be able to use the wizard anymore to do this. So if you were, if you prefer to use the wizard, once the database hit a certain size, things would time out, and you would, it would force your hand to move to a scripted setup, which for me, I think is better anyway. But for people who were managing a lot of these or were pretty new to it, the fact that the wizard would time out once the database got large could be very frustrating. So in 2016 and later, as I mentioned, you can still set it up the old-fashioned way that I just talked about, but something called direct seeding is an option. It's very, very cool. So what is that, and how does it work? So what it does is it does everything I just talked about, where it takes and applies a full backup and whatever log backups are necessary. It is doing that automatically. So it uses very traditional syntax. If you're comfortable at all with a scripted deployment of AGs, adding a seeding mode equals automatic to that create availability group statement. That's to a certain extent all it needs. There's a couple other things we'll talk about later from the permission standpoint that it needs as well. When this first came out in 2016, there was nothing in the GUI to do this. So if you went through the GUI to set it up, you were kind of going through the traditional wizard path and all those sorts of things. Management Studio 2017 forward. And if you're not running Management Studio 2017 or later, I definitely recommend that. We'll talk at the end a couple of reasons why it's really, really good if you're running AGs, but just in general, it's much better. It also now includes a GUI for this too. So you can, if you're uncomfortable dealing with scripted setups of AGs, then you can go through the GUI and choose direct seeding there, and it will handle all this under the covers. So the permission the user needs that is doing this is to grant create any database permission. That is important. And the availability group itself and the nodes must be configured before adding the database. Obviously, you've got to have the cluster underneath it. You've got to have the replicas defined within the availability group and things like that. Once all that's set up, then you can deploy your larger databases using this. So it can handle up to 5 databases at one time. It is single-threaded, so some of the parallelization we just talked about is missing here. But that's okay, because generally if you're setting up databases on those replicas, performance probably is not your foremost thing. Probably. So if you're in a setup, and I've managed these before, where if you lost a replica, say you lost storage on a replica, or something became corrupt or something like that, where if you're rebuilding replicas under significant time pressure, direct seeding is not right for you. But if you're managing a large environment with a lot of AGs and the SLAs and criticality of some of the databases are lower, direct seeding is fantastic, because you can just say, hey, just go ahead and take care of this for me. And it does. One last note here, the compression is off by default. If you are in an environment where your network infrastructure is already pretty overloaded, then you can run this, you can enable trace flag 9567, and it will compress the direct seeding traffic. So if you're somewhere where the network administrators yell at you when you rebuild one of these, that trace flag is going to help them yell at you a little bit less. Demo time. All right, so what I'm going to show you is how I define a read-only routing list on a real AG that I have running on 3 VMs on my laptop. And I'm going to show you not only how easy the read-only routing is to set up, going back to that first set of slides, but I'm also going to show you kind of evidence that it actually works. And before I switch over to the VM, I do want to note this is my wife's favorite slide in the slide deck, because it talks about round robin load balancing, and the picture is of a round robin. Anyhow, off to the demo. All right, and if somebody could type in the chat window, I want to make sure you guys are seeing this before I go into it. So if just one person can type yes, then I'll go ahead and dive into the demo itself. Excellent. Okay, good. Yeah, sometimes the Hyper-V doesn't play well with screen sharing, but thankfully today is not one of those days. So what I want to draw your attention to here is the way the read-only routing list is set up. So we can kind of skip over these. This is just kind of the basic nuts and bolts of setting one of these up. You define a URL and a port for the replicas to be established. And you define what those roles are going to be when they're not the primary. So you see secondary role right there. We're allowing read-only connections. You can actually restrict those. It can be, it's an odd design choice, but there are some instances where that makes sense. But what is most interesting here is, so this is the availability group that I have running. And what I've done here, so when the primary is on node 1, the read-only routing list is here. And what I want to show you is this set of parentheses that are highlighted there. Those are the extra ones. So I used to do this demo with 3 nodes, but unfortunately this laptop was not capable of running a 3-node AG and a domain controller all at the same time without something crashing. So you can imagine for a second, if there's a third node here, we would have node 3, and it would be outside of the set of parentheses that I have highlighted, and that would mean it wasn't part of the round robin load balancing. So if I took this away, all you'd see if you made a read intent connection is, unless HA node 2 was down and was not responding to the listener, every read-only connection would go to it. But because I have this extra set of parentheses, which is the only thing that we have to do, it's the only setup change that's different, that is going to flip back and forth between node 2 and node 1. So now I'm going to show you that. So what we've got a query here. We're going to run from the command line, a little bit easier to see. We're just selecting the server name. So we're going to prove there's no smoke and mirrors here. We're going to prove that it's switching back and forth between the two nodes that I have. But I want to call your attention to a few other things in the connection string here. So the server we're hitting is actually AG listener 1. That's the name of my listener. So a couple key things if you're not familiar with read-only routing. First, you need to connect to the listener to take advantage of it. That's very important. You also need to connect to a database that is within the availability group. So this is a problem I see commonly with people and companies that are new to availability groups and new to read-only routing specifically, is generally the DBAs will turn this on. They'll go to the devs and say, we've enabled read-only routing, so you can direct your read-only load other places, but they don't change the connection string in the app, so it's still connecting to some database that maybe is on the primary, but isn't in the availability group. And so then they come back and say, read-only routing isn't working because when I connect to the server, it doesn't go to any of the replicas at all. That's because they haven't included a database within the AG in the connection string. So that's important. Last thing that's important here, -K. So if for those of you who interact a lot with app devs, they're gonna, in their connection strings, there's something called application intent, and you would set that equal to read only, so it actually spells out as application intent equal read only. For here, that's -K. That means the same thing. So what we're doing here is we're connecting to the listener. We want to use the testDB database, and we're raising our hand and saying, I'm not going to write anything, I'm read-only, send me to the replicas that are in that list. And so we're going to run that. So you see it went to node 1 first, node 2, and back. And it really is that simple. So like I said, if you're in an environment where maybe one replica is really overutilized, or like I said, you've got managers coming to you and saying, listen, we've bought all this expensive hardware, we've licensed it, we've set it up, and we're only using a third of it or a quarter of it. This is a good, easy solution from our standpoint to get all of that used. So like I said, any questions about that, definitely throw those in the Q&A as we go along. Happy to entertain those at the end. And for now, we're going to go back to the slides with one more look at the fat bird. Okay, so this, so you'll note this on the slide, and then verbally I'm going to say something, and by the time I upload these slides or send them over to the group, I'll have updated these. So there are more auto failover targets as we go through the different versions. So in SQL Server 2012 and 2014, you could have 2 synchronous auto failover targets. So if you're not familiar with the difference between sync and async within an AG, I'll kind of briefly go over that. So if the replicas are configured synchronously, what that means is it's a multi-stage commit, basically. So the primary will commit, it will package all that log information up, send it down to the replica, and basically wait for the commitment from there as well before it moves forward. So in an environment where data loss is just an absolute no-no, synchronous mode is the answer there, but it can have a performance impact because obviously you're waiting for things to commit and logs to harden across more than one server. Generally, that's going to add some delay to your transaction. In a very robust environment, it doesn't add much at all, but in a less robust environment, it can add quite a bit. So there was a lot of customer pressure from 2012 and 2014 to increase the number of auto failover targets. And so in 2016 and 2017, that number was increased to 3. In 2019, and I have not personally tested this, but it is in all the documentation, everything they shared with MVPs and all that. In SQL Server 2019, this number actually increases to 5. So you can have 1 primary and 4 synchronous secondaries. They all have automatic failover support as well. So, and for those of you that are pretty new to AGs that don't understand what automatic failover is, it's basically 2 different ways you can set these up. You can tell the AG that you are designating a replica, 1 or more, as an auto failover target, and when it detects a disturbance that forces a failover, and we'll talk later about what some of those may be, it will fail over to those targets. That's putting a lot of trust not only in your design but in the decisions that SQL Server and the cluster are going to make. There's also a manual failover option if that makes you nervous or you'd like more direct control over what replicas are failed over to. So like I said, 2012 and 2014, you had 2 targets. 2016, 2017, you have 3. 2019, you have 5. So I get this question a lot, and actually the first time I gave this talk, the second part of this slide was not even on there. But I get the question a lot, what replica will it choose? So that's defined by the preferred owner list in the failover cluster manager. Generally, as DBAs, we're not looking at that. I would recommend familiarizing yourself with it if the Windows ops will let you in there, because it's interesting to look at. It's good to understand what's going on and what's defined in there. It's generally not recommended to play around with it, but it's definitely good to view. So as I know, it's modifiable. SQL Server generally maintains this. And speaking from experience, any modifications you make, the cluster and or SQL Server may make those modifications or may take those out. So any changes you put there, even if you know you clicked apply and OK, depending on the original setup of the cluster, it's going to undo your changes if it sees fit. And that's the reason that last bullet is here. So if you have a preferred automatic failover order, which obviously in 2016 and 17 and now 2019 is more important because we don't just have the 2 targets, we have 3 or 5. You want to add those in the preferred automatic failover order. So if you have, and I would recommend going into the AG setup that if you're going to use automatic failover, have a preferred order in mind and then add those replicas in that order. And you'll see in failover cluster manager that how that lines up in the preferred owner list. So again, any questions about that, throw those in the Q&A. We'll handle those at the end here. Okay, so I just talked about what might induce a failover. So there's a lot of things, but originally before 2016, the failovers depended on the health of the instance. So if something caused the database instance to wobble, then automatic failover would occur, whether it was a loss of storage or something like that. So always on AGs were always intended to provide redundancy at the database level. And it was not looking at the health of the individual databases. So if the instance, if something rebooted or again you lost storage or something severe happened, then that failover would happen where the instance was not healthy. The problem that caused, and I actually supported some customers that had this issue, is that if you were supporting AGs with a lot of databases, say for instance, an application that had grown over time and maybe it had a security database and a sales database and all these kind of small databases that made the application go, the situation you could get into is if one of those databases had an issue, corrupt storage, corrupt file, lost storage, something like that, the database would go suspect, but nothing happened at the instance level. So the way you would find out that some component of your app, some database that supported a certain part, the way you'd find out that it failed was usually a customer calling and saying, hey, this part of your app doesn't work. And it's because that database was suspect, the app could no longer get to it, but the instance was fine. So the AG never failed over. That was not good. It's never good when the customer is telling you that something of yours is broken and you don't know. So unless you had really granular monitoring, and unfortunately we're not all fortunate enough to work in shops where we have access to awesome monitoring tools like ones from Idera or SentryOne or places like that. Yeah, this was kind of a level of exposure that wasn't great. So in 2016 forward, and in 2019, this has not changed. The failover is much more granular. So out of the box, if you set up an AG, the default behavior is going to be the same. It's going to match earlier versions. It's going to fail over based on instance health. If you set DB failover to on when you create the AG, then a database health issue will fail over the entire group. So the scenario that I just walked through where we've got a security database that all the users sign into, and it goes suspect, but we don't know, and we think the app's functioning fine, but now nobody can log in. 2016 forward, if we have DB failover set to on, and this is in the GUI as well, then a health issue in any of the databases in the group triggers the failover of the entire group if you have auto failover on. So really nice feature that they've added here. This slide's only here so I can take a drink of water. Okay. So let's talk about a handful of other things, and then I think probably we'll have about 15, 20 minutes remaining. So basic availability groups. I put this in this talk because I want people to be aware of it. Microsoft is handling database mirroring in a very odd way. It's been deprecated for a long time, since 2012. It still exists. There's a direct recommendation in the documentation to not use it for any new solutions at all. But while that's widely known, they haven't necessarily publicized basic availability groups to the same extent. So what these are, they behave similarly. We'll talk about ways they're not, but they behave similarly to the AGs we've just been talking about, for the last little bit. It's not as fully featured as Enterprise at all. So you're limited to one database. You can't have more than one. Read-only routing is not an option. You can't offload the reads to the replica, and you can't offload backups to the replica like you can in the enterprise level normal AGs. You do manage it the same. So if there's something in your organization, especially if you're setting it up new in your 2016 or later, and you think, well, this is a perfect spot for database mirroring, use a basic availability group instead. You're going to get easier management, basically the same features. In my experience, performance is a little better, and you're building something on a feature that's going to be around for a while, as opposed to database mirroring, which could go away at any point. Okay, distributed availability groups. These are really, really cool. And I put them in here, even though it's quite possible that most of us won't work with them. They solve a couple of problems very, very nicely. So I want people to come away from this talk aware that these exist. So what this does is it allows an availability group across 2 Windows Server failover clusters. Each cluster can have its own node voting configuration and its own quorum mode as well. So that's generally, and I'll say this, if you're not aware of what that means, go talk to your Windows folks and ask them what that means. That's something that as DBAs, we need to have a good understanding of that. If that is not configured right, then you can lose the cluster quite easily. And when you lose the cluster, your availability group goes with it. So if you're not aware of what those settings are in your environment, definitely make yourself aware. You're going to be more fully in control of the situation if there's downtime, if you know what those settings are. A lot of times, at least in my experience, when you lose something at the database level, very senior DBAs get called, very junior Windows ops get called. So if you know the stuff that they know too, that's going to help you react faster. But anyway, I kind of off my soapbox for that. So the way this works is the data is sent one time from one AG to the other AG and then replicated. And note that I put that in quotes. It's not using SQL Server replication. It was just the proper term. It's replicated within the cluster. So when this was announced, some people had a concern where, say you've got a 4-node AG in a cluster in a data center in one place, you've got a 4-node AG in another data center. The concern was if it was sending those to all 4 nodes independently, so every bit of the traffic basically was flying down the wire 4 times. That's not how it works. It gets sent to the other one once and distributed throughout using normal availability group stuff. So what are some of the other rules here? The primary and the secondary AG, so we just talked about everything they can have that's different, including different operating systems. The primary and secondary must have the same setup of databases. That's important. This will not work absent that. So why do these help? What they really help for is if you're in a large organization and you're wanting to upgrade an availability group, maybe in the way we just talked about. Once you're on 2016, if you think there are features in 2017 you want, or you want the 5 replicas you can get in 2019, a distributed AG, a lot of times, is going to be the most graceful way to do that. It's also, if a lot of companies I go to are growing a lot by acquisition, and it makes their Active Directory setup very complicated. If you've reached the point as an organization where you're trying to bring all the different AD configs for the different companies you've bought kind of under one roof and make it make sense, you're going to be changing a lot of things that the clusters rely on to stay up. So if you're streamlining a lot of your naming and things like that, you're generally going to be moving availability groups to new clusters. A distributed AG is an awesome way to do that because basically you can set it up, one with the old AD, old cluster nomenclature and all those sorts of things, one with the new one, then you can have that running for a period of time and just cut it over, and there's not going to, there's going to be minimal downtime when you do that, as opposed to taking it down and then rebuilding something under pressure and on the fly. So a couple things here. The health of the secondary cluster does not impact the primary at all. So even though it's called a distributed AG, there really are 2 different components to it. And the reason it makes sense for migration is you can take that secondary up and down, and the primary will keep running. So you don't have to worry about, well, I've added these other 4 or 6 nodes or whatever, and now I have to keep all these up and running and talking. That's not true. That secondary can go away for a long time, and the primary really doesn't care. Automatic failover is not supported. I have seen people get very creative with scripting to enable something resembling automatic failover for this. While technically that's really cool, and the nerd part of me was pretty interested in it, I don't recommend that. There's a lot of scary stuff that can happen when you're talking about trying to automatically fail over something at this scale. We did talk about how the AGs themselves can be configured independently, so every setting they have can be different. Just the configuration of the databases themselves has to match. And another nice thing that this does is, if you work for a company that has multiple data centers that are a great distance away from each other, your options before this were not great. You were generally running a multi-site cluster, those can be difficult. They can be a bit of a pain. But that was your only option. And now you have this other option here where if the network between the two data centers is a bit dodgy and you don't want to rely on a cluster having to communicate across that, you can set up an AG in your primary, an AG in your secondary, and then those can be part of a distributed AG. And from a management perspective, for you, the DBA, that's going to be better. So another cool thing that happened in 2016 and later is we got proper DTC, so proper distributed transaction support within always-on AGs. I had a couple customers, this was a deal breaker. They loved everything you could do with always-on AGs, all the uptime stuff, they wanted all that. But they had apps that relied on DTC support. The DTC support was not there. Now, arguably in 2014, even though it wasn't officially supported, it kind of halfway worked. Certainly nobody on the record will admit to that, and it really wasn't production ready. But for specific customers, this is really cool. So I throw this slide in there. For most of us, it probably doesn't matter, but for the people that it does matter to, it matters a lot. Another thing that kind of came along with how the DTC support was implemented is there were some very specific issues with apps using Entity Framework. And if you were using connection pooling on the web server, that and an availability group, you would get some connection exhaustion issues because honestly, there were just some bugs there. This improvement corrected that as well. So we could talk a little bit more about this. I'll kind of rush through this, but if somebody's interested, this is going to be a big deal. So what do you need to get the DTC support actually working other than SQL Server 2016 or later? You need Windows Server 2012 R2 running on the servers. You need KB 3090973 as well. The availability group must have been created using the with DTC support equals per DB clause. That's a must. So if you have an already existing AG that you're upgrading to 2016, you're not going to have this support. You're going to need to rebuild it. It's a little bit of a pain, but worth it if this is something you need. Other than that, there's no application config changes needed at all. It's once you've done everything we just talked about, it just works. Domain independent availability groups. So this is pretty cool. So the traditional way that we're all kind of used to is your availability group was in a single domain. That was for clustering reasons and all that. Now availability groups are supported across the 4 scenarios you see there. All nodes in a single domain, nodes in multiple domains with full trust, multiple domains with no trust, and interestingly, nodes in no domain at all. So that's some pretty cool stuff there. Again, maybe limited use cases for it, but where we talked about where the Active Directory architecture is very complicated, like if you've bought a lot of companies or integrated a lot of different divisions that were set up differently, the ability to run availability groups independent of a domain is pretty cool. Along those same lines, so this is more specific. This happened in 2017. So everything we've talked about up to now is basically 2016 plus. This happened in 2017. So AGs no longer require clusters, which is kind of true and kind of not. So the cluster type switch, when you create an availability group, they added the cluster type switch. So it was Windows Server failover cluster, which we're all used to. You can designate external. So if you're setting up AGs on Linux and you're using Pacemaker, you would designate external there, or you could designate none. But I have this in bold type for a reason. If there's no cluster under your AG, there's no high availability at all. So it really is what is traditionally called a read scale AG. You're just looking to scale your reads across multiple boxes. You're not looking for the high availability aspect of an AG. So if somebody tells you, well, you don't need a cluster under that to run it, it's true, but you're not getting the full breadth of features that we've talked about. More changes. So I include this, I've gotten questions about it. For me, it's a bit strange. So there's a required copies to commit setting that defaults to 0. And these are for multiple synchronous replicas. So it defaults to 0. So what you can do is you can make it, as has been described to me, synchronous-ish. Is you can set that number higher than 0. So say you're on 2019 and you have the 5 synchronous replicas that you're allowed, but the required copies to commit to decide for the AG to decide the transaction is committed, you could set that number to 2. So you're only waiting maybe for 2 of the replicas to say, yes, it's committed, we're good, instead of all 5. For me, that introduces some potentially troubling scenarios, but it's an option. So I want you folks to know about it. We talked about read scale AGs. So, again, if you need a geographically dispersed AG and for whatever reason you can't set up a cluster, the combination of the domain independent AGs and distributed AGs, there's a lot of options here. We can do some pretty complicated designs, but easily scale our reads across a number of different nodes. These slides, I'm going to go through them pretty fast because I think we're close on time, but I want you to be aware of it. So remember I mentioned towards the start of the talk, if you're running a Management Studio version earlier than 2017, upgrade now. I think we're actually up to 17.9. This came out 17.4, so it was December 7th of last year. And what this does, and I'll briefly show this at the end of the talk, you can collect latency data. So if you're in a scenario like we talked about where you're not fortunate enough, you don't have a cool toy from Idera or SentryOne or someplace like that, and you don't have good monitoring on your AG, Microsoft's now given us some limited stuff out of the box to at least be able to see performance things. So you can, on the AG dashboard, which is in the GUI in Management Studio, there's a collect latency button you can click. The agent needs to be running on the primary and at least one secondary for this to work. So what does this do? It gives you some fairly well-designed reports that are easy to read. So it creates an extended event session for 2 minutes. It extracts that data into temp tables for the result sets that the reports need, then it drops the session, so it cleans up after itself. So these next few slides are basically here for resources, and I'm happy to send you my slide deck if you need it. I'm not going to read through everything it shows, but I want you to understand what it shows. So there's a lot of cool stuff there. Commit time, hardening time, like I said, basic performance metrics for an AG if you're not able to afford a monitoring solution. What are the gotchas here? This only works if your service account is a Windows auth account and it has sysadmin privileges. It can only run one collection at a time. It does require, so this actually runs on 2014. It's the only thing we've talked about that does. 2014 Service Pack 2, 2016 Service Pack 1, 2017 RTM. This works on 2019 CTP2 as well. And if you think this is really cool, want a lot more info, the link in the slide links to, I believe it's a Tiger Team blog that goes into great detail about exactly how this works, exactly what it shows, and all of that. So what I'll do, I'll briefly show you that button, and then we will take questions from there. So, all right, so we'll go to the dashboard for the AG that I have. And when this spins up, we've got happy green check marks, collect latency data. Now on mine, there's nothing to see. It's very boring. So this is the message you'll see. I'm not asking it to do anything right now, so the latency reports are incredibly boring, and I'm not going to bore you with those. But it really is that easy. If you satisfy the prereqs we just talked about, you can get some basic latency metrics here. So like I said, if you're supporting an AG but the budget isn't there for proper monitoring, this at least gets us the very basic stuff. So at that point, I am done, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right. Thanks, Matt. That was a wonderful session. So I'll let the attendees post their questions in the Q&A panel. While they do that, I have a few quick slides that I want to cover. So I'm going to take the screen share my screen. All right. Um, so you can post your questions regarding this session today in the Q&A panel right now, so that Matt can start answering them once I finish the slides. But later on, if you have any other questions related to any other topics, you can use our Facebook channel, the LinkedIn group, and also connect with us on the mobile app. But a quick word from our sponsors, SQLMaestros, who is helping us host these online events. There are a lot of content which you may be interested in, so please do visit SQLMaestros.com. They have got hands-on labs, which is literally firing up step-by-step instructions on what you want to learn and trying it on your own at your own pace. So it's really helpful in by learning by using hands-on labs. There's also corporate trainings and health checks that SQL Maestros performs. So there are helpful links that are posted here. And also you can get in contact with them about the classes at SQLMaestros.com. They're also conducting online master classes. These are full day deliveries. So the one full day content is divided into 2 days, half a day each, so that you can spend half a day and take a break and then come back the next day and continue the second half of it. We have speakers like Steph Lucky, Greg Lowe, Hamish, Peter Myers, Andy Leonard, Amit, and Warwick and Satya, who will be doing these online masterclasses. So if you're interested, please do reach out to them. There are phone numbers as well as the links that you can access more information about these online masterclasses. And this was the hands-on labs I was talking about. So there are a few of them which are available for free for you to try, but rest of them are paid. So you can go and explore what suits you and try out and talk to your managers and L&D departments to help you out to register. Please do subscribe to the YouTube channel, because the recording for today as well as the old webinars and the coming up webinars will be hosted here. And with that, I would like to hand it over back to Matt to answer the questions. Thank you everyone for taking your time today and attending the session. And thanks, Matt, for the wonderful session.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got a couple questions. They're really kind of related, so I'll handle them as one because I know we're close on time here. And on my time, my kids are about to